I'm going to cover a fair amount of territory this evening, and if there's anything that I say along the way, this goes especially for my students, but for anybody else who's interested, I'm always happy to elaborate later with you or to send you the slides or anything else. So I will cover a lot of territory, but it's in the interest of getting finally back to the extraordinary art that is here as part of this exhibit. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the work of Zarina Bimji at the end, okay? So the question for the talk is post-colonial thought still relevant to us? Why would I even raise that as a question? Well, I think we're well familiar with some of the arguments. Today we live in a thoroughly globalized world in which we have transnational business, transnational skilled workforces that travel around the world, people who show up in universities all around the world to teach, people show up to curate all around the world, etc. The old ideas of the lines between the colonizer and the colonized have long since been erased by much of this globalization. That's the argument, the happy argument, the argument of hope that's often presented to us. And by emphasizing the importance of post-colonial thought, what I'm attempting to do is to raise a question about whether or not this view is accurate. We might also wonder why we raised this question in Singapore. As you may have recently seen, Singapore is now the most expensive city in the world. You may not have just seen it, you may have felt it. I bought a $7 espresso today. There's also the question of why talk about the post-colonial in a rich, developed place like Singapore? What's relevance does it still hold? And of course, we could apply the same thing to the art world. Today, with the growth of all the global biennials, you can go and see great, new, and interesting art all over the globe. You don't have to go to Paris or New York for it anymore. So what's the point of sticking to the post-colonial? And indeed, what is the post-colonial? Well, I think first and foremost for me, the post-colonial is a long tradition, a living tradition, of the critique of our relationship to work. It's a long tradition of the critique of our relationship to work. And I imagine this is particularly relevant to my students, who are, many of them, studying business in one kind or another and planning to enter the world of work in a new way as a result of that. But I think it's a more general concern that we might also take with us into our analysis of what it means to be here in Singapore. Now, we're often reminded that globalization still contains work. This is a photo shot clandestinely of workers in Doha who are currently preparing World Cup stadiums for the Football World Cup. And if you've followed the news, you know that recently it's been exposed that these workers are working under some very, very criminal conditions in which they're dying from accidents at a rate which is really unacceptable, especially given who their employers are. But it's not just that kind of work. I mean, any of us who are in the business school know that globalization has also meant the growth of another kind of work, the kind that many of you are hoping to do if you're students, but also a growth that is connected to the rise of what are often called the creative classes, the growth of work connected to finance. What we're seeing is that generally work has exploded with globalization in all its forms. And it's exploded in a number of different ways. It's exploded in the sense that it is globalized, in the sense that one can be a financial trader in Buenos Aires or a financial trader in Johannesburg or a financial trader in Singapore in a way that previously wouldn't have been the case. It's also exploded in the sense that that means we have a 24-hour day when it comes to not just finance, but because of the power of media, pretty much all aspects of our life are 24 hours a day. It's also exploded in the sense that something's exploded within us in our relationship to work. As you well know, work is asking more and more of us. It's asking more of our personalities. It's asking more of our creative energies. It's asking more of our emotions. It's asking more of our psychology. we're increasingly asked to identify with that work. So when I'm talking about work exploding under globalization, I mean it in both those senses. Externally, but also somehow within ourselves, work has become an increasingly important part of what our identities are supposed to be, for instance. So I think that the lesson of globalization is not that we are one world, but that we are one working world. That there's been an explosion in work, and our relationship to work is more relevant than ever before. In fact, I would say that one of the things that globalization has done is that it essentially made work compulsory for everybody in a way that we've never seen before. Indeed, you could say that what globalization is really about is an absolute imperative to work. So our relationship to work becomes more and more important. Of course, this is true in the simplest sense that globalization has meant new levels of competition, but it's also meant innovations in management, innovations in financial techniques, innovations in what I would call algorithmic institutions, which can measure more finely and finely whether you are working, whether your work is productive, how efficient you are, what your relationship of your work is to work halfway around the globe. In all those senses, globalization has brought a world of work. And as much as RuPaul might find it fun, the rest of us are often finding it a burden.